Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is unmasking Jew haters and bringing them to justice, making them accountable for their cowardice, and in doing so, making the United States a safer place for all of us. We need to make the U.S. safer for Jews and for all Americans. We must literally unmask the pro-Hamas rioters. Hatred against Jews has escalated from protecting speech to illegal threats to illegal physical actions, including destruction of property. The blight of Jew hatred continues to intensify. That hatred is tangible in the United States, once the bastion of freedom for all. While world leaders from the top down have, for the most part, said the right things, in reality, their actions belie their words. They have done almost nothing to stop the illegal behaviors of Jew haters, who actively and more aggressively target Jews. Graduating seniors in high schools across America take the SAT exam to determine their eligibility for colleges and universities. A significant part of the exam is vocabulary, and throughout their schooling, certain words are designated as SAT words. One of those words is bloviate. Bloviation is empty political speech. Bloviated speech sounds good, but has no real value, no results. Bloviate is the perfect word to describe what U.S. politicians, leaders, and prosecutors are doing when they preach about fighting Jew hatred in America. Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States, a politician mired in controversy, was a proud bloviator. The biting and always acerbic social and political critic H.L. Mencken teased and skewered President Harding for his vacuous style of speech. While many liked the folksy style, to Mencken, it was nothing more than empty words. Harding, simply put, was full of hot air. Harding was a bloviator. Today, almost every U.S. politician sees the danger and the damage done by Jew hatred, so prevalent and so fierce, it can only be willfully and intentionally ignored. And yet the perpetrators have been almost universally treated with kid gloves. Their violations of law and policy allowed to flourish with neither remand nor punishment. Many leaders and lawmakers have been hiding behind the veil of freedom of expression for the perpetrators. In so doing, they are ignoring important tenets of democracy. In the United States, as in other democracies, there are essential limits to the freedom of expression. Advocating violence and making real threats are not protected speech. Destruction of property is not protected speech. Large group gatherings and protests, the numbers vary by jurisdiction, without permits, is illegal. The right to freedom of assembly and the right to petition government for redress of grievance is a First Amendment right guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States of America. The exact quote from the First Amendment is, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances," unquote. But there are limits. Every protest needs a permit. Within the permit, the time, space, location is very clearly specified. The reason for the permits limits the rules should be obvious, so as not to disrupt the rights of others, especially the free flow of traffic. And that is the part that the pro-Hamas Jew haters either do not understand or simply choose to ignore. Time and time again, in interviews with pro-Hamas leaders, when asked about basic issues of law and their protests, they all repeat the exact same phrases. Exchanges go something like this. An interview asks, "Do you think you are justified in destroying property, breaking into buildings, scrawling graffiti, breaking into offices and occupying them?" The interviewee responds, "People think that property is sacrosanct. It is not. We do not believe that property is sacrosanct," unquote. So too with masks. A de rigueur part of an ensemble worn by keffiyeh-wrapped pro-Hamas protesters. During COVID, masks were mandated, and as a result, many jurisdictions that had prohibited facial masks and all facial covering since the mid-1800s had to modify or change their laws to permit medical masking. The purpose of the original anti-mask laws was to be able to identify people who broke the law, like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan members, or, for that matter, bank robbers. People hid behind their masks. No one knew the identity of the KKK members, and because of the masks and the anonymity it provided, evil people could do and say things they would normally never say because their identity was not known. So too today. But remember, even during COVID, one needed to drop their mask to pass security inspections at airports. Jewish leaders across the United States are asking that local and state leaders reintroduce mask laws. There will obviously be important health exceptions, but honestly, 200 18 to 20-year-old protesters on campus can hardly all suffer from emphysema or immunocompromised diseases. Without a mask, protesters are suddenly no longer anonymous. Without a mask, they can easily be identified and held accountable for their behavior. Without a mask, police and campus security can trace protesters to determine who was local, who was a student, and who was come from outside. Most importantly, when wearing a mask, the protester will know that they are intentionally violating the law and risking their professional futures. Unmasking becomes a disincentive to violate law and empowers leaders and law enforcement to shut down this hatred. Unmasking will signal Jew haters that lawmakers are no longer merely bloviating. They are taking action. Coming up next, Points of View. Both columns today deal with the biggest question on the agenda in the midst of all lovers of Israel. Hezbollah, what is happening and what will happen, and what will be the impact of an increased tension or conflict with Hezbollah. One column is from the Jerusalem Post and one is from Ynet. First up, the Jerusalem Post. The column is written by David Weinberg and was published on June 22nd, 2024. It is entitled Brace for Impact as Hezbollah Escalates in North. We Must Prepare for Emergency. Opinion. Subtitled, Israelis hanker for such leadership today. The emergency immobilization of society and economy described and certainly necessary. And Israelis assuredly will be up to the task. This is how Weinberg begins. A cold, calculated analysis of Israel's strategic situation will reach the conclusion that this country faces a decade of tough warfare on 7 different fronts, mainly against Iran and its proxies. Enemy armies and militias are entrenched on Israel's borders, with Iran actively arming and seeking to radicalize Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, as well as in Jordan. Full-scale war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is 2 days or 2 years away at most, will be an earth-shattering event in particular, bringing inevitable destruction of unprecedented proportions to civil infrastructure in Israel, as well as in Lebanon. Weinberg suggests that while Israeli leadership is not fully prepared for the inevitable, Israelis themselves are instinctively understanding. They see the severity of the threat, and he writes, neither the Israeli military nor home front is sufficiently geared to handle this grim reality. Therefore, the government of Israel must embark on an emergency effort to significantly strengthen the IDF and to mobilize the public in preparing for long-term struggle in wartime conditions. This requires the enactment of punishing economic decisions and a change of mindset led by leaders with both grit and vision. I believe that the Israeli public instinctively understands the dramatic inflection point where this country now stands and the sacrifices that yet will be required to guarantee the country's very existence, beyond the enormous sacrifices of people and material that already have been made over the past 8 months. Weinberg dedicates much of his column to detailing all that is necessary to bolster Israel into a war or near war condition in order to save Israel and save Israel's economy. He quotes Major General Gershon HaKohen, a military historian as well as a military strategist, who brings sad and chilling examples from Israel's history of war and the decisions that Israel's leaders made in order for Israel to win those wars. Weinberg writes, Major General Reserve Gershon HaKohen, who is the most ideologically rooted military thinker in Israel today, argues that rekindling an ethos of national struggle in Israel now and acting decisively on this basis is both essential and possible. He recalls that Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, did this before and during Israel's War of Independence in 1948. It entailed throwing Holocaust survivors off the boats from Europe into battle, drafting of teenagers into work brigades and senior citizens into factories and fields, and even rationing of most basic foodstuffs. It involves subserviating all aspects of the economy to the war effort. After the Yom Kippur War disaster, HaKohen says, Israeli leadership also knew how to rapidly rebuild the military, aggregating every resource to do so despite global boycotts, mushrooming debt, and economic depression, and without succumbing to too much legal and other government bureaucracy. In his conclusion, Weinberg quotes Churchill's famous Blood, Sweat, and Tears speech. He writes, in May of 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously girded the people of the United Kingdom for an arduous path ahead before he drafted every single Briton into war service of one type or another. He warned that, and he's quoting now Churchill, we have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and suffering. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, he said. You ask what is our policy? I can say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalog of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer with one word. It is victory. Victory at all cost. Victory despite all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. Israelis hanker for such leadership today. The emergency mobilization of society and the economy described above is certainly necessary, and Israelis assuredly will be up to the task. A sobering column, one that leaves us with much to think about. Now, the column from Ynet. This column was written by Ron Ben-Ishai and published on June 18, 2024. It's entitled, This is How Hezbollah Became Israel's Greatest Threat. Subtitled, Analysis, Hezbollah attacks Israel thought were made to support Gaza after October 7th, now are proving to be an existential and growing threat against the country. This is what we should do about it. Ron Ben-Ishai asks a similar question to the question asked earlier in the previous column. Ben-Ishai's analysis sees multiple threats against Israel after October 7th, with special focus on Hezbollah. He begins, from an Israeli perspective, the war in Gaza began as a catastrophic event within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Initial fears held by security officials that Hamas's atrocities on October 7th were the first stage in a coordinated attack by Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran on Israel were dispelled within days, partly because the IDF reserve forces called into the north thwarted such intentions by the axis of resistance led by Iran and Hezbollah to exploit the incident and damage Israel further. Thus, the war began with primary Israeli objective being to dismantle Hamas militarily and administratively, and free the hostages, both alive and dead. The attacks launched by Hezbollah in the north and the Houthis in the south were perceived as secondary incidents intended to aid Hamas in its war and force Israel to split IDF forces across three fronts, including the West Bank. Ben-Ishai now explains that objectives of war have since changed. He explains it this way. To that end, Israel's strategic perception saw fit to first defeat Hamas in Gaza, believing Hezbollah would be deterred and agree to a political arrangement that would push its elite Radwan force and its anti-tank missiles northward to approximately the Litani River, about 10 kilometers away from Israeli border, once this happened. Over the past few months, however, and particularly since the Iranian offensive on Israel in April, the situation has shifted. The war transformed from a very violent and even fateful Israeli-Palestinian incident into a full-fledged regional war with strategic security implications and even existential risks for Israel and its citizens. Ben Ishai gives many examples of what has happened and what needs to be done in order to counteract it. He explains that an agreement is not enough for Israel when it comes to Hamas and Hezbollah. He writes that there must be clear evidence of military success in order to move ahead. In his conclusion, Ram Ben Ishai makes it very clear that for Israel to achieve its goals, it must have U.S. support. In his words, he writes the following. These achievements require prior agreement and coordination with Americans. Israel won't achieve even a partial victory in the ongoing regional strategic war without the United States. Partnership and active involvement. The Prime Minister, who will soon address both houses of the United States Congress, should prioritize renewing the close alliance with our friends across the ocean in every detail. Benjamin Netanyahu's upcoming speech in Congress is important, but reaching clear and binding agreements with the Americans regarding the continued conduct of war is even more important, even if it requires painful compromises that might endanger the integrity of the coalition he currently leads. It's likely the opposition will provide Netanyahu with a safety net if he reaches agreements during his visit to Washington that will enable Israel to achieve a strategic victory in the war. This is a clear analysis of the situation now facing Israel. Thank you so very much, Ram Ben Ishai. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 7 cartoons today. No memes, no headlines, so sorry today. Many of the cartoons are biting. They are extremely anti-Israel and anti-Bibi, who symbolizes Israel. These are a few examples of what many people think about Israel, as seen through the eyes of popular cartoonists around the world. This first cartoon is a commentary about the claim Bibi Netanyahu is making that badly needed arms are being withheld from Israel by the US administration. Bibi is sitting in a tank outside the White House. The Israeli Prime Minister has just sent off a shot and knocked off a corner of the White House. And he says, "I assure you, President Biden, that I mean no disrespect. I'm sure." Next up is a cartoon entitled Israel's Gaza Exit Strategy. According to this cartoonist, Israel is just going around and around an oblong circle. This next cartoon is just as critical and just as biting. An interviewer asked Netanyahu, "How many Palestinians will you have to kill to be satisfied?" And Netanyahu's response is 6 million, a biting, ugly, awful critique of Israel and Netanyahu. This next cartoon appeared in London, and I was taken aback and shaken when I saw it the first time. It's called Gaza Nuclear Armageddon. We are shown a depiction of the aftermath of the nuclear destruction in Gaza. Now a cartoon from South America that depicts Bibi putting Gaza into a food blender, and Gaza is totally destroyed and blood is all over. These two final cartoons critique the red lines that the United States has drawn for Israel and Rafah, or Rafiah, we used to call it. In this cartoon, Netanyahu, aiming a rifle, is behind the red line, but it is an elastic red line, and he is expanding it. Finally, we see President Joe Biden's red line. It's a jump rope, and Netanyahu is jumping over and stomping on Gaza. Critical and yet disturbing. In a moment, More of my own perspective and a few predictions. Yemen's Houthis have been engaged in a relentless barrage against U.S. and also Israeli forces. Yemen's Houthi rebels claimed that their forces attacked the U.S. aircraft carrier Dwight D. Eisenhower in the Red Sea. The United States is disputing that claim, speaking to the Reuters news agency on condition of anonymity. 2 U.S. officials told Reuters that the claim is false. As background, the Iran-aligned Houthis first launched drone and missile strikes in key Red Sea waterway in November in what they said was solidarity with the Palestinian militants in Gaza. According to the U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, their forces destroyed 3 Iranian-backed Houthi uncrewed surface vessels, sort of drone boats. And while Houthi forces launched 3 anti-ship ballistic missiles into the Gulf of Aden, CENTCOM reported that there were no injuries or specific damage reported by U.S., coalition, or merchant vessels. French police arrested a 19-year-old and a younger male on suspicion of planning an anti-Semitic attack against Jewish targets during the 2024 Summer Olympic Games in Paris, scheduled to begin in July. The two discussed their intentions on a shared Telegram chat. They were thankfully arrested before they were able to set their plans in motion. According to the Wall Street Journal, the number of people killed in the Hajj this year, the pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, has already risen to over 1,170. And that death toll is expected to rise. Hundreds of people are still listed as missing, and many others are hospitalized. The Hajj began on June 14th, and nearly 2 million Muslims came to pray at the site. Extreme heat with temperatures around 52 degrees Celsius, which is equivalent to over 125 degrees, about 127 degrees Fahrenheit, is directly responsible for the deaths and hospitalizations. According to Reuters, of the more than 1,000 people who died during this year's Hajj, most were pilgrims from Egypt. Security and medical sources told Reuters that the Egyptian death toll had risen to over 670, and another 25 were missing. An Egyptian crisis unit tasked with investigating the situation said it suspended the licenses of 16 tourism companies and referred them to the public prosecutor, accusing them of being responsible for the deaths it said were mainly among pilgrims not registered under the official system. That is so sad. Every Muslim dreams of making the pilgrimage, and this year's Hajj turned into disaster for so many people. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that in 1993, Arik Einstein and Shalom Chanoch, 2 Israeli folk heroes, songwriters renowned for their poignant lyrics and magical orchestration, wrote a beautiful ballad entitled Uf Gozel, The Little Bird Flies. This song tells the tale of a parent bird watching as their little bird learns to fly and then soar away. Arik Einstein died in November 2013, about 10 years ago. He was arguably one of Israel's greatest soul singers and lyricists. Uf Gozel is one deeply moving example of his creative spirit. When listening to this song, one cannot but think of the Nova Festival and all the young people slaughtered and massacred when all they wanted to do was soar, and all the others across Israel's envelope communities bordering with Gaza who were killed on that fateful Shabbat that coincided with the festival day of Simchat Torah. The song has always been an Israeli classic, and now it has become even more popular after October 7th because of its power and its message.
הגוזלים שלי עזבו את הקן, פרסו כנפיים ועפו, ואני ציפור זקנה נשארתי בקן, מקווה מאוד שהכל יהיה בסדר. תמיד ידעתי שיבוא היום שבו צריך להיפרד, אבל עכשיו זה ככה בא לי פתאום. אז מה הפלא שאני קצת דואג? אוף גוזל, חתוך את השמיים, טוס לאן שבא לך, רק אל תשכח, יש נשר בשמיים, גור לך. עכשיו נשארנו לבדנו בקן, אבל אנחנו ביחד. חבקי אותי חזק, תגידי לי כן, אל תדאגי, ביחד כיף להזדקן. אוף גוזל, חתוך את השמיים, טוס לאן שבא לך, רק אל תשכח, יש נשר בשמיים, גור לך. אני יודע שככה זה בטבע, וגם אני עזבתי, כן, אבל עכשיו כשבא הרגע אז מחניק קצת בגרון, מחניק קצת בגרון.
A song for the ages. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.